Hi, I'm Carrie Morton, and welcome back to our Teach Out series on concussions. We're returning again with John Prose, former Michigan state legislator who worked on concussion legislation. So John, let's go back to 2013. The legislation has been implemented, and you've done a victory lap around the Capitol with your kids, and you're very excited. But was there anything in that legislation that you had hoped you could get implemented that you weren't able to?
So
at that time?
At the time, we were utilizing some of the model legislation that the NFL was pursuing.
Okay.
We weren't able to get it exactly like that because if you'll recall from the first segment, we talked about the questions that needed to be answered from the Michigan High School Athletic Association, from the Michigan Medical Association, from physicians and others that could provide some data and some understanding. And then in the implementation of it, we really left it, as most of us as legislators do, the detailed implementation. We provide the framework, but the implementation needs to be the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, it's important for legislators to watch how that goes to ensure that it still adheres to the purpose of the legislation. And sometimes departments of state will do their own thing that really has no bearing on the legislation itself. That requires a little bit of back and forth between legislators and the administration folks who are implementing. In this case, we left a very wide open berth for the folks who would be implementing it to do so. And we found pretty quickly that there were some burdensome components that they had put into place that required some legislative change over the years then after that. And one of which was, I saw very directly, I was signing concussion legislation requirements that I had read the material, that I had seen the material information, and my wife at the time was also coaching an AYSO soccer team with my daughter. Not one team, but two teams.
Not as a legislator, as a parent.
As a parent.
Yourself.
I'm watching the implementation as a parent. My wife is coaching as a youth sports coach. Happens to be on two of the teams that my children were playing on then also. So we're signing multiple documents for multiple children. We're the same parents of the same children, but we're signing 4, 5, and 6 different documents saying that we've read the concussion material to have a better understanding of what to look for, how to manage it, what to tell a coach, who are we responsible for, etc. So the implementation required some changes over time to just be more effective. You don't need to tell the parent 6 times the same thing. You need to tell the parent that this is the most recent information. So we changed it to an annual, that you had to make sure that at least annually you saw the latest information from the Department of Health and Human Services.
Well, I think actually this could be a national model, making sure that legislators are actually engaged in their legislation once it's enacted. It sounds like a pretty powerful model. It caused you to go in and update that legislation.
It did, and that was in cooperation with the Department of Health and Human Services and the folks who were implementing it there. And they're doing a great job with it because keeping up with something that is as complicated as this is, and there is no standard protocol that is perfect for every child or every injured athlete simply because of the science behind it. But the more research, the more information we know, the better the data becomes and the better the protocols are. That's ultimately what we set into place, was the opportunity for the protocols to continue to be updated on an annual basis. And then we as parents of athletes it can at least be given the best information on how to keep them safe and secure.
So a model that can grow as we learn more
Exactly.
about concussion risk.
Exactly. That's
terrific.
exactly right. Insert the best information here, solve the problems of the children over there.
And so now that we're in a good place where we can evolve our education based on what we know in terms of concussion science, it feels like Michigan is in a good place.
I think so. I think that there is always room to improve. I think that there's always room to improve because the science continues to catch up with what's actually happening on the ground. And we know that these athletes exhibit different signs of concussive injuries. They exhibit different impacts from those injuries.
That's right.
One student who can return the next day may not be prepared to return, but shows all the signs of being able to return. So it is not an if-then statement with a definitive answer. Instead, it needs to be the best education possible. And I think Michigan, as one of the first states to put this into place, didn't err on the side of overburdensome regulation, instead erred on the side of education, and that's really where I was pursuing the best benefit of it.
That's terrific. I think I've heard in the concussion space the quote, if you've seen one concussion, you've seen one concussion, right? They're all unique.
That's right.
And having a framework that allows us to identify all those variety of symptoms of a concussed athlete is really important.
Exactly. And it's not just athletes too.
This is
It can
true.
happen to any kid that happens to take a fall, take a hit, or otherwise, or an adult for that matter. It's not just children, right?
That's right.
We all have a brain that only has so much space in it, and if it gets dinged pretty good, it can be a problem.
That's right. So Michigan, having really pushed forward and been one of the states in the forefront of concussion legislation, is exciting. And now we look back, it's 2019, there's concussion legislation in all 50 states. What do you think the opportunity might be, or is there an opportunity for a national approach to concussion safety?
I'm not sure that I would be in favor of a national approach. And the only reason I say that is that the way that our states operate, they become incubators or test beds for new ideas. If we have a single managed system of concussive actions and activities and protocols across all 50 states, where do we have room for the creative next step in addressing those science problems? Because the science needs to follow it, right? Well, Oregon may not be as prepared as Michigan to utilize the science because maybe the University of Oregon doesn't have the great work that University of Michigan is doing, for example. But University of Michigan wants to implement this new protocol and as a test bed, as a new test with it. They coordinate with the good people of the Department of Health and Human Services. Maybe it requires legislative change, and a legislator that is in office today is willing to try to make that happen. They then show by the science of it that it's been really effective. Well, then maybe Oregon pays attention to it at a later point in time and implements even a better treatment protocol or a better requirement along the way. And really, it ought to not be about requirements. It ought to be about what's best for the athletes and utilizing the best science that's available today to inform that. So I'm not sure that I would want to see a national program for it. Maybe the NFL would. They're concerned about the longevity of their players. They're concerned about the longevity of their operations and maintaining the interest that many people have in pro football and college football. Shoot, we're on one of the, I think it is the winningest college football campus right now taping this interview in all of college sports, right? I mean, so the University of Michigan and Michigan football are synonymous. So you want to make sure that football remains a part of the American culture. Doing it in all 50 states, I'm afraid it would be too burdensome and wouldn't allow for innovation.
And so it sounds like, from your perspective, having the ability to share best practices,
Yes.
for example, between an Oregon and a Michigan, is probably the way to have the most progressive.
Even between Michigan and Michigan State, even.
From a Wolverine to a Sparty. Exactly. Yeah. That's okay. That's great. So we're now about 6 years on from when the legislation was enacted in Michigan. And as you reflect, what do you see as some of the biggest points of impact of this legislation for concussion safety in Michigan?
Sure. I think the biggest point of impact is that we won't ever really know what the impact was. The fact of the matter is that students have been pulled out of games that otherwise would have gone back in. Student athletes who have been concussed had to go through a protocol to give them the best chance at health and wellness when they got back on the playing field. Coaches are now required to think carefully before they put a kid back into the game, whether it be soccer, football, basketball, or any other sport for that matter. We may never know the benefit that has given to the students and the student athletes that have had injuries along the way. And you think back to the time that we all knew that it was rub some dirt on it, get back in the ball game. That isn't the way that it's thought of any longer, and I think that has a significant impact has been made by the legislation being out there in and of itself, so that when my kids, who are now junior and senior in high school and 7th grader, they were little kids in 2011 when we first started talking about this legislation, and then passed it in 2012, implemented in 2013. That's 6 years of families and parents having the best information available to them on what to look for and how to be careful about it. Same with coaches. I think the culture has changed around this idea of rub some dirt on it and get back in there. That was a great hit. Well, it was a great hit, but it injured you. And it could injure you for the rest of your life if you don't at least pay attention to the symptoms and the signs and ensure that the protocols are there to get back on the playing field in a healthy manner.
I think as a parent myself of two sport athletes that actually, in contact sports, your legislation means that for my athletes are quite young. I never knew a world where they could have been put back in had they been concussed. So as a parent, that's terrific. Feeling very secure that they are going to be taken care of and safe. So
that's great.
Yeah, so thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure to have you here today with us to talk about your great work in this space. And, on behalf of athletes in the state of Michigan and parents, thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And I'm glad to hear that your kids and mine on these playing fields will be safe to at least know that the best protocols are in place.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us in this segment. We look forward to having you join us in the next segment of this Concussion Teach Out.